Video 2, Benefits and Drawbacks. As you saw, globalization is a complex and multifaceted process. Beyond what people mean when they say globalization, I want to touch with you on some of the benefits and drawbacks of this process. I'll mention three of each. After watching this video, I'll ask you to read one social thinker's criticism more closely. So, three benefits. First one is variety and availability. Life in the globalized age is full of excitement and variety. At least if you are lucky enough to be in a richer part of the world. Life seems to be never monotonous or boring. We have a lot of different products to choose from. They come from all over the world and express different cultures. They are often cheap and even free, like YouTube videos, for instance. We get to travel to different places and experience different ways of life. We can communicate with all kinds of different people, whether it is online or when we meet them as travelers. We can keep in touch with people we met like no time before in history. And we just have a lot of stuff available for us. If you're making some kind of a living, you can get a lot of the things that people in the past could not have imagined very cheaply. To sum up, we live in a consumerist society enabled by global production and trade. It can be a lot of fun. Well, fun isn't the only issue here. The fact that more people have access to computer and the internet means more opportunities to learn and develop job skills. It also means that a larger variety of voices and opinions can be part of our world of communication. Two, spreading prosperity, spreading wealth. Supporters of globalization make an argument that that globalization enables the spreading of wealth. Until the mid-20th century, production was mostly centered in the West, so nations of the West kept almost all of the wealth produced by industrialization. The rest of the world was mostly just a source for raw material and a kind of customer for the products produced in places like Europe and North America. And they did not prosper as much as the Western world. In the age of globalization, a lot of the production is done in poorer countries, and the poorer countries, the poorer nations, draw money from the richer countries that buy their cheap goods, their cheap products. Eventually, some of this money reaches the poorest people in the world who now have fairly good work conditions in the factories that manufacture all these globalized products. So many people, many groups of people have become more stable and more successful thanks to the funds that are created by industry and the funds that are sent back home by workers abroad, by immigrants. Thus, the resources of the world are spread more evenly, more equally among the nations. Another aspect of this is that charities as well have become more global and more successful, more powerful, more richer nations and individuals send aid to the poorer countries. And the third benefit is international stability and preventing a global war. As I said, globalization of production and of politics and finances and law means that nation states are more and more dependent on each other. They give up independence for the resources that globalization enables. They need each other to survive and prosper. You could argue, there's an argument to make that this interdependence fosters political stability. If you need medical equipment from another country, or you need gas to run your cars from another country, you are less likely to fight an all-out war against that country. If a corporation has influence in governments and operates in two rival nations, these nations are less likely to go to war, because it would be unprofitable for that corporation, unless that corporation makes weapons, to have these two places where they make money be entangled in warfare. It will prevent them from making money, so they'll influence the politicians, they'll influence those countries to avoid war. If there are a lot of global organizations like the United Nations and the justice courts in Hague, and even regional organizations like the European Union, there are forums in which to work out difficulties and problems between states without going out to all-out war. Now, obviously, we all know that there have been many local wars during the last 70 years. But since the end of the Second World War, people have feared another global war, first between the US and the USSR, but other players have gotten into it as well. So the fear was a global war that will use nuclear warfare, atom bombs, and will basically completely destroy the world. This, at least for now, has not come to pass. And you can make the argument that the increased globalization of the world is part of what prevented such a war, and perhaps continue to prevent it and even make local wars less common. So these were three benefits of globalization, or arguments that there are benefits for globalization, but it's not all optimistic and fine and pink. There are several drawbacks and problems. Again, I'll explain three of them with a little more detail. So one, exploitation of workers. Globalization means that supply chains and manufacturing and finance are extremely complicated, extremely complex. When you buy a product or invest in a company, which maybe a lot of you don't think of yourselves as investors, but if you have a pension plan, that means that that you are investing in companies through that pension plan. We have little idea where the money goes and who benefits from it. We do not know how much extreme exploitation of workers went into the products that we're buying. We don't know how little money workers made from how many hours of work. We don't know the working conditions. Some of them might be dangerous. It's almost impossible to know because it is so complex and far away. Some of the products we use were made by political prisoners, or in dangerous working conditions, or with starvation wages. We just don't know. During the 19th and 20th century, many countries passed laws to protect workers within their borders. But when companies can offshore send away their production to states where the rules are less strict, the state's ability to protect workers is damaged, right? Each nation state can pass laws within its borders. It can't control what's happening in another country. Thus, because the complexity and fluidity of the globalized era, many workers in the production centers of the world, South America, Asia, are very much exploited, are used to their detriment, are used in a way that hurts them. consumers and investors can't always avoid such exploitative companies, even if they care to do so. And of course, a lot of consumers don't really care. But even if you do care, you can't really control it. When you buy something that was made in Israel, you can know that it was most likely made by workers who made a minimum wage, and the factory followed the safety rules required by the state. We can find out what the laws are and be pretty sure that they are fair. And if they're not fair, we can ask the politicians to change them. But you cannot do that when you are buying something that was produced in Cambodia. You have no influence on what's happening there. You can stop buying the products, but that's not always a possibility. And most people don't care enough. Second drawback, loss of jobs and destabilization. A connected issue is the loss of good jobs in the Western world. While work in the factories is often very difficult, during the most of the 20th century, it was mostly stable and fairly safe. Salaries were fine, and whole communities were built around factories in cities and towns. The ease by which companies now today can undertake production in factories far away, can offshore their production, caused many factories in the Western world, in the United States, for instance, in England, to close, and many jobs were lost. Some of the workers were permanently unemployed. Some turned to service industries like cleaning and selling small products, like in a supermarket, retail. In such service industry work, the pay is not as good as in the factories and as in production. You can't organize the labor so easily, so they don't have collective bargaining, and the job is not as stable as this used to be in the factories for most of the 20th century. At the same time, immigrants from poorer parts of the world are willing to work for less money and do jobs that other people would be reluctant to do without good pay. So even the jobs in the service industries and the caring industries remained in the West lost their value and became even less attractive for most people who are already living in those countries. We can see this, for instance, in Israel with the many foreign workers from mostly Asia who care for the elderly. Like, all this could not have been possible without increased globalization. The loss of jobs can cause a lot of problems. People often turn to legal and illegal drugs and alcohol. There's a very serious opioid abuse problem in the US right now. This problem is often worse in the places that used to depend on industry, like these places that were built around factories, and the whole community depended on the factory for their living. And these communities were totally ruined, and that's made worse by abuse of drugs, and it's a very sad sight. People without a job become angry. They are often more politically radical. That causes instability. In the last decades, this political radicalism is more to the right than to the left. They are prone to believe in racist and anti-immigrant propaganda. Few of them, most of them don't, but few of them turn to violence. Generally, it creates a less cohesive, less united society, and it creates a lot of unhappy individuals. Perhaps it's the most crucial, most acute problem with globalization is its ecological cost, the cost to the environment. When you want people, materials, and products to travel the globe back and forth, right? You remember, if you want a t-shirt then the cotton may have been grown in the US, then shipped to China, then shipped back to the US to have it printed, then shipped to Israel, and you get a T-shirt that traveled more kilometers than you ever have. You need energy to propel. So when you want all these products to move around and all these people to move around as immigrants and as tourists, you need energy to propel all these trucks, boats, and airplanes. This energy is mostly based on burning fossil fuels, mostly based on oil. This burning emits CO2 and other gases into the atmosphere, and these cause global warming and climate change. So the travel and mobilization of products itself has an enormous ecological repercussions, but this is not all. So travel and mobilization of products have enormous ecological repercussions, but this is not all. Globalization enables very cheap products, which leads people to be more wasteful. When we buy something for 20 or even 200 shekels, we're not really likely to use it carefully or fix it if it breaks. We just buy another cheap product and throw the old one away to the trash. A lot of these cheap things are made of plastic, of course, which never decomposes. Another problem similar to the regulation of work conditions is that while some countries make laws to protect the environment, these laws do not affect the countries where a lot of the products they consume are made. Thus, countries with economies that are dependent on polluting industries do not pass such laws because they want the economic growth. While the richer countries can afford to protect their environment, poorer countries or countries more dependent on industry do not pass such laws or pass less strict laws. However, the climate of the world is global. This is whatever happens in one part of the world can affect the whole world. For example, when Brazilians burn down rainforests, so there's more space to farm cows, all the world has less trees to turn CO2 into oxygen. But also, to be sure, it's not just the Brazilians' fault, because many countries in the world import the meat, etc., from Brazil. Without globalization, there would not be so much demand for deforested land that sustains the cattle, the cow industry. Globalization is a major factor in the environmental crisis we are in today. But let me end this video on a bit of a positive note about globalization, because global warming and pollution are a global problem. It will need to be solved or at least mitigated with globalized effort. All the world will need to pitch in. It is possible that the political, legal, cultural, and even economic networks created by globalization will be crucial for any attempt to stop or mitigate the current climate crisis. We'll need global cooperation. So I can end this video by saying that globalization got us into this problem, and we'll need globalization to get us out of it.